I worked the night shift at the Halcyon Annex for 6 years before I ever said her name out loud where anyone could hear it. Officially, there was no name to say. The intake manifest called her Subject 41. The transfer paperwork called her a Class Null specimen, harvested from a border war nobody back home had ever heard of, and Class Null meant the law didn't require anyone to treat what was in the pod as a person. It meant you could run a genetic assay on her twice a week, log her vitals like a furnace reading, and never once have to look her in the eye. I looked her in the eye. That was the whole of my crime in the end. The annex ran 40 stasis bays down 2 corridors, cold blue light and the hum of coolant lines, and I did the rounds alone from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, checking seals, swapping filters, signing off on readouts nobody upstairs ever read closely. Bay 41 was the only one where the occupant wasn't kept fully under. Some quirk of her physiology meant deep stasis damaged her, so they kept her in a waking hold instead, sedated just enough to be manageable, awake enough to know exactly what she was. The first time I spoke to her, I asked if the ration paste was giving her trouble. She looked at me the way you'd look at a door that had suddenly decided to answer you back. "You're allowed to ask that," she said. "I'm not asking anybody's permission," I told her. "I'm asking you." Her name, she told me much later, was Kaelith Voran. Not that night. That night she gave me nothing but a long look and a small, careful nod, like she was filing me away as a variable that hadn't behaved as predicted. It took months before she trusted the food I smuggled her wasn't a new kind of test. It took longer before she let herself believe the collar I quietly recalibrated, the suppressor band fused to the base of her skull, meant to keep some kind of bioluminescent marking dormant, wasn't a trap either. I never asked her what the marking meant. She wasn't ready to tell me, and I've learned that some things a person has to choose to say, not be made to. What I knew, without her having to say a word of it, was that whatever she'd been before the war that ended with her in Bay 41, she carried herself like someone who had once commanded a room, even sedated, even filthy from a transport crate. She held her spine like there was still a throne behind it. Nobody else in that building noticed. To them, she was inventory with a pulse. Administrator Drell walked past her bay twice a week reciting numbers into a recorder. Growth markers, yield projections, resale value, and never once slowed his pace. It was Drell's numbers that changed everything. I wasn't supposed to have access to the acquisitions log, but 11 years of night rounds teaches a man which doors nobody bothers to lock. 3 weeks before the transfer, I found the draft contract sitting open on an unattended terminal. Full genetic and bloodline rights to Subject 41, sold outright to a private buyer off in the outer reaches, no questions asked, no records kept past the sale. Drell had priced her like scrap metal. He had no idea, or didn't care, that the buyer's due diligence report, buried 3 pages deep, flagged an old royal cipher match against her genome. Whoever was buying her knew exactly what bloodline they were purchasing. Drell was about to hand an empress to strangers for the cost of a shipping manifest, and never even know what he'd sold. I told her that night, kneeling by her bay with the corridor lights dimmed for the hour I was supposed to be on my break. "They're selling you," I said. 3 weeks, and whoever's buying knows what you are, even if Drell doesn't. She was quiet long enough that I thought I'd broken something in her. Then she reached up. Slow, deliberate, her hand shaking with the effort of fighting the sedative, and touched the collar at the back of her neck. "Before this," she said, "I was Regent Empress of the Voran line. My own steward marshal sold the coup to buy his own survival. I woke up in a cargo hold, 3 systems from home, with this thing fused to my spine, and I have spent 4 years being told, every day, in every possible way, that I was never anyone at all." Her eyes were wet, but she didn't look away from me. "You are the only person who has ever asked me a question and waited for the answer." I told her I wasn't going to let them auction her off like a piece of salvage. I meant it the way you mean the truest thing you've ever said. The 3 weeks between that night and the transfer were the longest I've lived through. I kept working my rounds like nothing had changed, because if I so much as blinked wrong at Drell in a hallway, 6 years of small mercies would end with both of us worse off than before. I brought her real bread instead of paste, and once, when the corridor was empty past midnight, I brought a folding chair and sat with her for an hour just talking. About nothing. About a garden she remembered from before the coup. Wild jasmine along a stone wall. She asked why a maintenance man bothered learning the names of ration crate flowers for a woman with no crown and no country. I told her a name was the one thing nobody could revoke, and I intended to keep using hers. She started saying mine back, quietly, like she was testing whether it still belonged to her to use. Joran. Just that. It was the smallest thing, and it did more work in me than any speech could have. The night of the transfer, the annex ran a full systems audit, Every log, every camera, every door, all of it routed through one overworked server for 6 hours, while the auditors from head office reviewed the books upstairs. It was the one night in a year the building went half blind to itself. I'd been counting on it for 3 weeks. I cut her loose at 2:30 in the morning. The suppressor collar wasn't built for gentle removal, but I'd learned its wiring the same slow way I'd learned everything else about her. A little at a time, patiently, without asking for more than she was willing to give. It came free with a soft click and a hiss of released pressure, and for a moment nothing happened at all, and I thought maybe I'd been wrong about everything. Then the mark along the back of her neck and down between her shoulder blades caught fire. Not fire, light. A deep storm gold luminescence rising up through skin that had spent 4 years looking as flat and gray as everyone around her wanted it to look. It climbed her throat, traced along her collarbone, and when she opened her eyes, they'd gone from the dull amber I'd known to something brighter, something that looked, for the first time since I'd met her, entirely awake. Senna Rourke was on guard duty that hour, the one honest officer left in a building full of people who'd stopped being honest a long time ago. She came around the corner with her hand already on her sidearm, and then she saw the light, and she stopped so hard her boots skidded on the polished floor. I watched her face go through disbelief, then recognition, then something that looked almost like grief. She'd served on a border cutter 20 years back, she told us later, patrolling the old Voran reaches before the coup, and she'd seen that exact tracery once, stitched into a ceremonial banner nobody back home ever expected to see lit on a living person again. Senna went down on one knee in a maintenance corridor smelling of coolant and floor wax, and she didn't ask permission to do it. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice cracked on the second word. Caliph reached down and took her hand, drew her back up gently. "Not tonight," she said. "Tonight I need a friend more than I need a subject." We didn't wait for a court, or a fleet, or a crown. There wasn't time, and there wasn't need. Senna killed the corridor cameras for the 6 minutes it took us to reach the loading dock, where a small unmarked transport, sent quiet and dark by whatever was left of the Voran loyalists once Calith's cipher pinged an old emergency beacon buried in her own bloodstream, was already settling onto the pad. At the ramp, she stopped and looked back at me. "Come with me," she said. It wasn't an order. I'd have known the difference by then. I told her I would, not because I understood thrones or courts or what it would mean to stand beside a woman who used to command a system full of worlds. I went because somewhere in 6 years of night rounds, without ever meaning to, I had learned her the way you learn a person. One small kindness at a time, until it stopped being kindness and became simply the truth of how I saw her. She took my hand at the top of the ramp, in front of no one but Senna and the closing dock doors, and she didn't need a courtroom to tell her what she was. She'd known it the whole time. She'd only needed one person, in one building full of people who called her a number, to look at her like she had a name. I gave her that. It turned out to be enough to save an empress,